Look, in preparing today, I've had a great deal of assistance. I'd like to thank Judith and Hilary for the great work in the Caulfield Grammar Archives. And we stand on the shoulders of those who've gone before. So Graham Farley, Michael George, Brian Fost, and other people in both Malvern and Caulfield communities who've done a great job in assembling material for us. Well, in setting the scene, today is not the time to talk about the grammarian medical officer who contracted venereal disease, was discharged from the army and sent home in disgrace. You must remember in those days it was considered a mortal sin. So because he had lost the respect of his troops, he was discharged. But you must understand also that the army would have written a letter to his wife to outline the circumstances of his dismissal, and as was the custom of the day, his name, along with all others who had contracted such a condition, would have been published in the daily newspaper. Nor am I going to talk to you about the grammarian who, because of his repeated absence without leave, spent most of the war in prison. He was still there in mid-1920. And the army then deemed that he'd forfeited his war medals. Well, instead what I tried to do is to find some stories that you might not have heard of before, to try to highlight the range of experiences that our grammarians had as a result of the war. So these numbers taken from the honour boards are fairly accurate, although as Judith will tell you, we still have correspondence from descendants complaining that their ancestor's name is missing from our honour roll. When you consider that many of the boys, or not many, but a number, also went to Scotch or Malvern Grammar or Wesley, perhaps it's understandable that Caulfield hasn't got all of the names where they should be. Well, let's begin our stories. We think that about 80 to 100 grammarians served at Gallipoli, with 25 definitely being present at the landing, and 17 Caulfield and 4 Malvern grammarians losing their lives during the campaign. 5 grammarians were lost on the first day, and only one of them has a marked grave. Throughout the presentation, I tried to show Caulfield grammarians listed in white and Malvern grammarians listed in red. And just to confuse you, and sometimes I'll have their names in black. Now, apart from the landing on the 25th of April, the greatest loss of grammarian life occurred in less than 24 hours on the 6th and 7th of August 1915 during actions at the Lone Pine and the Neck. Here we can see, when I visited Gallipoli some 8 years ago, we took photos. Here is the memorial at the Lone Pine, where most of the missing have their names mentioned. You can see that FETHERS, Major FETHERS from Malvern Grammar, has a grave because when he was killed, his body was taken down to the beach and put there. So one Caulfield grammarian, Kenneth Brown from the 11th Battalion, was killed at Lone Pine late on the 6th of August. But early the next morning, the 7th of August, 4 waves of Australian light horsemen were cut down at the position called the Neck before they reached the Turkish line. If you've seen the film Gallipoli, this is where it happened. Now, I took this photo, and on the very left, you can just see a headstone, and about 2 paces to the left were the Australian trenches. Over here are some graves and monuments, which you'll see in the next slide, and that's about where the Turkish trenches were. So we're talking a battlefield that's about the size of the tennis courts that you park your cars next to here. And this white ridge line here has been obviously put in recent times, but it's a sheer drop. So the soldiers really had nowhere to go. The Australian war historian wrote this: A failure to synchronise watches meant that the Allied bombardment stopped 7 minutes before the advance at 4:30 a.m. As a result, the first line of 150 men from the 8th Light Horse was swept away by Turkish fire almost as it rose up. The historian notes, everyone in the line had been knocked to the ground before they'd advanced 10 yards. 2 Caulfield grammarians, Colin Crannan and George Ormerod, who was 19, of the 8th Light Horse, were both killed in this action. The second line, also from the 8th Light Horse, and the third line, mainly from the 10th Light Horse, with some fill-ins from another battalion, were fully aware that they also were going to their deaths. But the historian records they did not hesitate. But their valour was not enough, and they were also cut down in the same manner as the first line. I took the first photo there. You can see how far back I've moved to take the second photo. If I take one step back, I'm over the side of the cliff. So that gives you some concept of how small the battlefield was. 3 Caulfield grammarians, Gordon McRae and Andrew Rowan from the 10th Light Horse, and William Groom from the 14th Battalion, were killed in these charges. So in the course of 1 hour, 650 men and officers out of 800 were either killed or wounded. The historian concludes his report. The flower of the youth of Victoria and Western Australia fell in that attempt. But grammarians were also fighting in other armies and on other battlefields at exactly the same time. One was Malvern grammarian Charles Reginald Hanfield, who in 1895-6 was named the captain of the cricket team and the undefeated football team at Malvern, and he was also declared the school athletics champion, and he's recorded as having thrown the cricket ball a record distance of 100 yards, that's 91 metres. Now, he moved to Johannesburg in South Africa, and in 1901, during the Boer War, he joined the South African Army, and he fought in the 1st Imperial Light Horse as a corporal. Now, interestingly, we've discovered that he played first-class cricket for Transvaal in the 1908-09 season. But on the outbreak of war in August 1914, he joined the Natal Light Horse, again a unit of the South African Army, again with the rank of corporal. Now, we need to keep in mind our history. Germany had colonies right throughout South Africa. Here, here, and here. Here, we're talking particularly about German Southwest Africa, where the German army was stationed. In what was the very first Allied success of the war, Hanfield was part of a flying column that chased the German army out of South Africa and back into German Southwest Africa, now called Namibia. And there's a tiny little place here we can see, and it's called Gibeon Station. Now, this happened on the 27th of April, 2 days after the landing at Gallipoli. But in the fiercely fought action against the German army, nearly 30 of the Natal Light Horse soldiers were killed. And amongst the casualties was Charles Hanfield, the second Malvern grammarian to be killed in the First World War. You can see the bleak sort of country that it's in, and his grave is about the fourth from the right at that end. It's also interesting to note that German soldiers are buried alongside the South African soldiers as well. So Hanfield died of his wounds on the 6th of May 1915 and was buried in the war cemetery there at Gibeon Station. Who would have thought a Malvern grammarian from Melbourne would find their way to a grave in Namibia? We know historically that about 80% of the Anzacs were unmarried, but an exception was Bertram Atkinson, again a Malvern grammarian, And he was the only son of the Reverend James Atkinson, an Anglican minister, and his wife Margaret. He enlisted in the 23rd Battalion in February 1915, and before embarking for active service, he married Ursuline Bourdonnais on the 20th of April, aged 27 and promoted to lieutenant. He left Melbourne just 19 days later, just 19 days after his marriage, and he sailed to Gallipoli. 4 weeks after his arrival, he was killed in action whilst tunnelling at Lone Pine. He was commemorated in a number of ways, notably on this stained glass window, which is at his father's then church, St Stephen's in Mount Waverley. His widow, Ursuline, died in 1965, but like many sweethearts or widows from First World War, never remarried. A considerable number of grammarians were declared as missing in action, and I want to talk about those towards the very end. William Fender, who was here from 1901 to 1903, was a boarder from Meetung, and he won prizes at CGS for debating and athletics. He was wounded at Gallipoli. He transferred to the 2nd Light Horse and served in the Middle East Campaign. He was promoted to 2nd Lieutenant, and he joined the 1st Battalion of the Imperial Camel Corps in early April 1917. On the 21st of April, during the Second Battle for Gaza, he was first reported as missing in action, and then as a POW. In 1919, a year after the war finished, his family had still not received official news of his fate, and they expected him to be released with other POWs. And his service file is full of heart-rending letters from his parents. For example, his father wrote, "Much uncertainty as to William's fate exists. My own impression," this is 1919, "my own impression is that my son may perhaps be lying somewhere in a Turkish hospital in a paralysed and helpless condition." Sadly, their hopes were dashed when a report came to light from an Australian POW who'd reported seeing Fender lying mortally wounded on the battlefield. And so William was eventually declared died of wounds received in action. As we'll discover, like many Malvern and Caulfield grammarians, he has no known grave, and his name is recorded on a panel in the Jerusalem War Memorial. His father wrote that amongst William's extended family, 10 of his cousins were either killed in action or died of wounds. Some families feature prominently on both schools' honour rolls, and 3 in particular stand out. The 7 Davies names on the Malvern honour roll represent 3 different families. Sir Matthew's son Henry Gascoigne is also proudly claimed as a Scotch collegian by Scotch College. Now it should be noted that Henry belonged to the same battalion as Caulfield grammarian Lieutenant Richard Gibbs, who we'll hear about later, and they both were killed in the same battle at the Battle of Fromelles in 1916. Now of interest is to note his brother Arnold Mercer served in the Boer War, the First World War, and the Second World War. That's a pretty remarkable record. He served 3rd Battalion ANMEF, is the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force that in September 1914 captured Rabaul from the Germans and then established, in fact, Australia's territory in New Guinea for protectorate for the rest of the war. Almost no photos, I should say, Sir John was the one who built Valentine's, and his son Howard Erskine died in France in 1917. This is the only photo we can find of any of those 7 Davies boys. And as can be seen, they lost 3 of their number during the war, 3 out of 7. Tragically, for the Looker family, again of Malvern Grammar, the war saw the end of the male line of their family, as one non-soldier brother had died of tuberculosis in Melbourne. whilst the other 3 were casualties of the conflict. Lieutenant Frederick Keeplooker, on the left, was a member of the 22nd Battalion. He served at Gallipoli, he fought at the Landing, and also at Lone Pine. His battalion was evacuated with only 40% of their strength left. He was evacuated to the Greek island of Mudros, and he developed a flu-like illness and was then transferred to hospital in Malta, where he eventually died of jaundice in November 1915. On the far side, Sergeant William Robert Looker served with the 5th Battalion again at Gallipoli and Western Front, but he was very badly wounded by shell fire on the 22nd of November 1916, and he died. By an absolute sheer coincidence, his brother, Arthur, happened to be visiting him in hospital at the same time as his brother was serving in France. Captain Arthur William Looker is a very interesting case. There's some interesting points about him. At the beginning of the war, he was working as the manager of a timber company in Mozambique, of all places. And he joined the South African Army as an anti-aircraft gunner based in Walvis Bay, not far from where Hanfield was killed. Ironically, this anti-aircraft unit made itself, they did such a good job, they made themselves totally redundant by shooting down the last German aeroplane in that part of Africa. Well, he then moved to England. He joined the Cambridgeshire Regiment, a lieutenant, was mentioned in dispatches and won a military cross at the Battle of the Somme. His regiment was disbanded due to the heavy losses, and so he returned to South Africa. He joined the King's African Rifles, and he fought the Germans in German East Africa, the other side of the continent, until the end of the war. Now, he returned to Melbourne. He married in 1924, but he died of kidney failure in 1926. Now, if you look carefully the next time you're at Malvern, you'll see that his name has been added to the list of war dead on the honour roll, and yet he died 8 years after the war. The FETHERS family of both Caulfield and Malvern contributed 9 men to the war and escaped relatively unscathed, only losing one of their number. The Caulfield FETHERS boys are the only example we know of an Australian family where 5 brothers enlisted and 5 brothers survived. The Malvern grammar, we can see, Earl killed on the first day at Anzac, but his younger brother James, his father wrote on his file that his brother James was not to be sent out of the state until he turned 19 years of age. Like it'd make a difference. But there we go. We can see the range of areas that they served in. Well, school sporting teams were often quoted to younger grammarians to encourage them to enlist and as a role model of courage and sacrifice. One notable example is this Caulfield 1911 athletics team. Now, the facts and figures speak for themselves. Of interest is what W.M. Buntine said in 1919, where at speech night he said, "You can see from these figures the importance of athletic training as preparation and therefore a gallant service in the war." I couldn't see the principal saying that to an assembly today and getting away with it. Here is the record. We can see the 4 who died. Again, it's just a little microcosm, a small slice of men who served. Lyle and Murray Buntine to 1912. We need to remember that very few Australians, particularly as the war went on, could join our flying corps. We only had 4 squadrons at the time, and it was very, very difficult. So young men, as Cuttle did, paid their way to England to join the British Army and then transferred. Cuttle is unique because he has a Victorian town named after him. He came to Caulfield as a boarder from Swan Hill. He tried to enlist in the AIF, but they didn't want him because he was nearly 2 metres high. That's 6'7". And he was rejected. So he paid his own way to England. He joined the British Army and then won the Military Cross for bravery in action on the Western Front. Eventually, when they developed bigger bombers, he could fit in the cockpit. And so he transferred to the Royal Flying Corps, but on a bombing mission in May 1918 was shot down near the town of Villers-Bretonneux. But his body was never found. In 1924, the Cuttle family sold some land on a bend of the Murray River at Swan Hill, near where they lived, and they named the settlement Robin Varley after him. The Latin word Varley means farewell. And just as our Year 12 students had a valedictory dinner to fare the well-known from Caulfield, in typical Australian fashion, we don't call the town by its correct name of Robin Varley, but we call it Robinvale. In 1934, Robinvale became twinned with the town of Villers-Bretonneux in France. And if you travel to either of these towns, you will find displays to this Caulfield Grammarian. In 1914, many grammarians, we need to remember, were members of various militia units, while some were already members of the Australian Army. Bertrand Combes attended CGS from 1908 to 1911, and he played in the first 18 of 1910 and 11, in the latter year being premiers. He became the first Caulfield grammarian to enter Duntroon, having been placed 5th in the examinations for the 1912 intake, bearing in mind that Duntroon only opened in 1911. He made contact with his old school, and he arranged a football match at CGS between the first 18 and the visiting Duntroon cadets on July the 22nd, 1914, just 13 days before the First World War broke out. So we know a number of those cadets were killed at Gallipoli. Along with the first two classes of the college, he received a special graduation in 1914, and he was wounded at Gallipoli in May. Now, he was perhaps fortunate because graduates from his Duntroon intake fared the worst of all in the first 4 graduating classes from Duntroon. Out of his class of 36 cadets, 19 were killed during the war. After recovery from his wounds, he undertook a variety of administrative posts for the Army, and he returned to Australia. Eventually, Bertrand Combes rose to become the very first graduate and the very first Caulfield grammarian to become the Commandant of Duntroon in 1942, at which time he was awarded a CBE. We know that many school teachers also enlisted, and it should be noted that over 21% of Victorian state school teachers who enlisted never returned. The most well-known example from Caulfield's teaching staff is Hugh Lamb-Smith. I've chosen these 2 photos in particular because he was with the 2nd Field Ambulance, and the 2nd Field Ambulance, I don't know if he's in the photo, but this is them at Gallipoli, and here they are on the Western Front. So he landed with the 2nd Field Ambulance at Gallipoli on the very first day. He served with this unit throughout the Gallipoli campaign, as well as on hospital ships. Eventually, Lamb-Smith contracted both typhoid and enteric fever, and he was so ill he was invalided back to Australia. When he recovered, he rejoined his unit in France, but almost immediately was severely wounded in the leg. Upon recovery, he was promoted to Lance Corporal and was sent to work in a casualty clearing station, virtually at the front line. Now, we need to remember with the field ambulance that they carried no ammunition, they carried no weapons, but they shared everything that happened to the fighting men. And the war historians from Australia record that in no other unit in Australian, in the AIF, were the casualty rate higher than amongst the field ambulance. After the war, the responsibility fell to him on Anzac Day to read the names of the fallen. Some of them, of course, former students of his own class. Over the years, in fact, Lamb-Smith became the embodiment at CGS of the Great War experience. And he urged boys to follow the Anzac tradition, not the military endeavours. but the examples that the soldiers had displayed of selflessness, courage, and sacrifice. He was a source of incredible support to the principal of Caulfield, Walter Murray Buntine, who on a personal level as a principal had to deal with the deaths and disablement and loss of so many of his former pupils. But on a personal level, Buntine had cause to grieve for the losses in his own family. Walter Murray Buntine was the principal of CGS. He was a family man, a devout Christian, but this deep-seated belief must have been very sorely tested as a result of the many tragedies that befell his own Buntine family and that of his wife's relatives, the Gibbs family, as a direct result of the Great War. His oldest nephew, Richard Horace McConaughey, Gibbs Mac, was here from 1908 to 11. He was the eldest son of Dr. and Mrs. Richard Gibbs of Colac. He was in his 4th year of medicine at the time of enlistment in 1915. He was known as a prominent athlete. In fact, he appears to be one of the very first Caulfield Grammarians to have played VFL football. And he played 35 games and kicked 3 goals for University in the 1912, 13 and 14 season. He was just 24 years old when he lost his life in his very first battle upon the German trenches at Fromelles. He's reported to have led his men of the 59th Battalion very gallantly in the face of heavy machine guns, but he was eventually killed within a few yards of the trenches and was awarded a posthumous military cross. Now, the war historians tell us that this, after Gallipoli, was the debut of the AIF on the Western Front, and it described the Battle of Fromelles as the worst 24 hours in Australian history, not just military history, in Australian history, because over 5,000 casualties were suffered, with 2,000 dead. In fact, the 59th and the 60th battalions, 59th was Gibbs, were practically wiped out to a man. Walter Horace Carlyle, or Lyle Buntine, was the eldest son of the principal, and he was Richard Gibbs' cousin. Lyle became a medical student at the university, enlisted in the medical corps, and eventually, when he reached England, transferred to the Royal Flying Corps, became a lieutenant, served with 11th Squadron on the Western Front, where he, as you could in the aeroplanes of that time, was shot down 6 times and survived. During an aerial combat over France, he was eventually shot down for the last time and survived. He was badly wounded, awarded a military cross, but badly wounded. So badly wounded in the arm, he was sent back to Australia to convalesce. And in fact, he lived with his family in Glenwood over here, the principal's office. And during that time, he went to a Caulfield Grammar Assembly. And the records tell us that the students, just like today, could have listened forever and ever to the guest speaker as he told thrilling stories of the Western Front. Oh, sorry, in my dreams. Eventually, Lyle returned to England and to duty. But at that stage of the war in 1917, Australia suddenly realised they didn't have enough doctors. And Melbourne and Sydney were the only universities that had medical faculties. And so the government gave special permission for any medical student in the military forces to be taken out of the army and put back in university to finish their course. And that was the case with Lyle Buntine, except 3 weeks before his papers arrived, he was killed in a flying accident, instructing a student pilot, and was buried in Scotland. John Harbinger Gibbs was the youngest son of Dr. and Mrs. Richard Gibbs and the younger brother of Mac, and he was Lyle Buntine's cousin. He served in Egypt, he served in Gallipoli, but he became very ill at Gallipoli and eventually ended up doing a desk job in the pay office in London. It was while he was there he developed a particularly bad cough and showed symptoms of serious chest trouble. So he was sent back to Australia to convalesce. And he was sent just up the road here to the Caulfield Military Hospital in September 1917, where he was admitted for treatment for tuberculosis. But because his father was a doctor, he was given special permission to leave the military hospital and go under his father's care at Colac. He began to improve in weight, and his friends and family were all encouraged to believe he was going to recover. But he suddenly succumbed to the tuberculosis and died on the 13th of October, just a month after his arrival in Australia. And he is buried in Colac. Now we stray a little bit from grammarians here, but I think the point could be made about the Buntine connection. Robert Andrew Buntine attended that Cardinal College Place in Hawthorn, with his, although it wasn't there then, with his brother Walter Buntine, and he was an uncle to all the Buntine and Gibbs boys. He lived in South Africa, and he served as a medical officer in the Boer War, and later became a member of Parliament representing Durban in the South African Parliament. He was a widower, and Robert's two daughters, Jessie and Minnie, attended boarding school in England during the war. And it was when he was returning to South Africa with them in September 1918, 2 months before the end of the war, that their ship was torpedoed by a German submarine. The lifeboats were launched, with women and children first. But when the lifeboat with his two daughters tipped over, Robert dived in to rescue them. But only the youngest daughter, Minnie, was ever found alive. Robert was held in the highest esteem by the residents of Durban, who subscribed to a hospital ward named in his honour, as well as putting up a plaque in the South African Parliament. Jessie had finished school and was 18. She'd been attending school in Tunbridge Wells with her sister Minnie. And Lyle Buntine, in his letters, writes about the many holidays he spent with Jessie and with Minnie and with their auntie in Scotland. A tragic loss. Well, finally, Richard Horace Gibbs. He attended also Scotch with Walter Murray Buntine, and the two were the closest of friends. In fact, Walter married Richard's sister, Bertha Gibbs. He was an uncle to Lyle and Jessie Buntine, and as you heard, he became a surgeon and a medical practitioner at Colac, and he ministered to his son John. But after John's death at home from tuberculosis, Richard was so shattered at losing both sons, and perhaps losing one whilst he was in his father's care, he sold his medical practice in Colac, and he became, as Major Gibbs, the senior surgeon at McLeod Military Hospital here in Melbourne. But on the 13th of July 1919, at the intersection of St Kilda and Domain Roads, Richard fell from the rear platform of a cable car to the road, where he struck his head, lost consciousness, and died. Walter Murray Buntine had lost 6 family members in a 3-year period between mid-1916 and mid-1919. Well, we come towards the end of our time. I just want you to note these figures here. Figures can seem very bland when we should never forget that we have someone, a person like us, behind those figures. The research shows us that many of the grammarians, both Malvern and Caulfield, enlisted together, sailed together, served together, and in some cases died together. For Malvern, as I've explained to some Malvern grammarians already, the lists are not very complete. But we have found quite a number of honours that Malvern grammarians won during the war. It's interesting, during the war, the newspapers were very keen to publish lists and tallies of the private schools. You know, who had medals, who had more VCs than others. But the schools were very unhappy about this, as you can imagine. And they kept such notices to themselves. You can understand why. Here are I guess if you like, the tally for Caulfield. Although it's interesting that the Victoria Cross is well and truly claimed by Wesley College, because Robert Grieve, who attended here as a young boy, went on to Wesley College. His VC is housed at Wesley College, and Wesley College marched with his battalion, the 37th, on Anzac Day. But he really went to Caulfield first. I thought it'd be interesting to look at the school duxes just as a slice to show you, I guess, a cross-section. Caulfield had duxes from the first year, from 1881, and we note that 13 of those duxes enlisted. Barber, the dux of 1888, was aged 43. The cut-off point for the army was 44. After that, you had to plead special cases like you were a major general or something. So he just snuck in. But the dux of 1916, Andrew was the youngest at age 19. And we should note that Malvern, who was the dux of 1905 and the secretary of the CGA, was killed at Gallipoli in the landing. But all other duxes survived the war. Caulfield introduced school captains in 1909. It's a little chilling, in a way, to see that every single school captain enlisted, except one, because he was in fourth year medicine. And I guess he saw that his job as a doctor was going to serve the community and he should finish his degree. Every other school captain enlisted. Interesting to see that Robinson, the captain of 1911, also joined the Camel Corps as well. Well, when we come to the end days, as best as we can figure out, the Malvern Grammarians had 124 who enlisted. We know that 16-ish died, leaving Arthur Looker aside. The Davies and the Looker family suffered 3 deaths. The oldest Malvern grammarian to die during the war was Charles Hanfield in Namibia, who was 37. The youngest was Stanley Oliver, Cecil Stanley Oliver, whose photo's over here, and also here. He was just aged 21. He joined almost the day he turned 18. We look at Caulfield. The oldest grammarians killed were George McCartney and Edward Duncan, who were both aged 40. It should be noted that George McCartney had also served in the Boer War. The youngest, I want to see 6 deaths in the extended Buntine family. The youngest Caulfield grammar death was Robert Nash, pictured here. He was only 17 years and 25 days old at the time of his death in 1918. He'd only been at the front for 2 weeks and 2 days. He had, very ungrammarianly lied about his age. Unbelievable, I know. And he'd enlisted when he was 16. But amazingly, he passed himself off as 21. Now again, it's remarkable because no Australian serviceman was allowed to go overseas between the ages of 18 and 21 unless they had written permission from their parents. I kid you not. And the files show letters from both parents saying, I hereby give permission for my son to go overseas. So clearly, in Nash's case, somehow his parents' signatures had appeared on the correct form and he passed himself off. Quite incredible to think that when he died, he was younger than most of the Year 12 students here. I think it's always important, and it's very salutary to think that of those who lost their lives, a considerable number had no marked graves at all. Hence the incredible importance of honour boards in schools. You know, we need to remember that families had nowhere to mourn. I was talking to Andrew before. There are recorded examples in Melbourne of families who bought cemetery plots, who put up a headstone with an empty grave for their son, so they'd have somewhere to go and mourn. So our honour boards become an incredibly important part of the fabric of our school community. We can see here that where the 16 grammarians are buried, 5 have no known grave. When we come to Caulfield, again a larger school, 28 have no known grave. You know, I'm just a primary teacher, but that's about 37% of grammarians have no known grave. And again reinforces the importance of what we do at our schools to remember their name. Well, the final facts, if you like. A tally sheet at the end. We think, and again I haven't got all the figures from Malvern, I'm sorry for that. We think that between 1881 and 1921, about 2,500 boys passed through Caulfield. Now of those, bearing in mind the very young and the very old, or the halt or the lame, about 17% of all living Caulfield grammarians enlisted, which is pretty remarkable. We can see 555 enlisted, 86 killed or died. I think the figures for the other schools are important for us to note as well. Again, at the time, they would have been larger schools than both Caulfield or Malvern. But I think it's interesting to note Eton College, again a school of enormous size, again lost about 20%. And when one looks at the figures for those major English public schools, the figure tends to be about that 20 to 25%. So it's easy to rattle off figures, but these are all people who went to school just like us. It should never be forgotten. Well, in conclusion, ever since the first school Anzac Day services in 1916 at Malvern and Caulfield, we have commemorated these grammarians as part of our school family. I think it's important to remember them. We need to remember most of them were unmarried. Many were the only sons of their families. And because of this fact, they have no direct family left to mourn them. In a sense, at both Malvern and at Caulfield, we are their school family descendants. And we carry that responsibility each year to ensure that their names, their stories, and their sacrifices are never forgotten. To paraphrase a well-known song, time does go forever, but it falls to us, the living, to ensure that the memory of these grammarians remains. Thank you.
Well, I'm pleased on behalf of us all to congratulate and thank Daryl for a marvellous presentation. How well researched it was. It touches every heart in this room, Daryl, to remember the contribution of those lads who went away and fought for a cause. We remember the tragedy, the terrible business of Gallipoli. What a dreadful part of our history that is. I can't understand myself why it's so glorified, but we've learnt today of sacrifice and commitment to a cause, and I think you did a marvellous job of filling us in on some of the details that we wouldn't have learnt. You know, a 16-year-old passing himself off as 21 and getting to the war and lasting a fortnight. What tragedy it was. All the youth that we lost to a terrible cause. But the research you did, Daryl, was outstanding, and I think this has been one of the most interesting addresses I've heard in this room. You've done very, very well, and thank you on behalf of I have here a Oh, you Daryl, a little present that the soldiers didn't get.
Thank you. Oh,
And there's no tobacco or anything to go with it. Do enjoy it.
thank you very much.
Now, while I'm standing, I'll ask you all to raise your glasses as I propose a toast. To this great school, Caulfield Grammar School.